Thanksgiving morning, 1968. Firebase Sierra sat shrouded in mist across the Central Highlands. Through the open bay of his UH-1 Huey, Specialist Robert Sohn tracked red tracer fire cutting through the fog. His M60 hung from bungee cords, barrel heat radiating against his legs. 2 months into his Vietnam tour, at just 23, he'd already absorbed lessons the Army never taught stateside. At 1,500 feet over hostile territory, helicopters offered zero cover. No concealment, just wind, an open door, and enemy gunners below with their weapons trained skyward. The numbers told a brutal story. More than 10% of all Vietnam casualties were helicopter crewmen. Out of 6,175 Americans killed in helicopter operations, 2,074 served as aircrew. Among them, door gunners suffered the highest death rate of any aviation role. They sat exposed in open doorways, wielding 30-pound machine guns, tasked with suppressing ground fire, while their aircraft hovered at flight's most vulnerable moment, the landing. What none understood during those early missions, they weren't just fighting an enemy. They fought physics, tactics, and a fundamental truth about rotary wing warfare that would take years to fully grasp. The door gunner position wasn't engineered for survival. It was engineered for effectiveness. In war's brutal arithmetic, effectiveness often demands sacrifice. Understanding why door gunners didn't survive Vietnam begins not in Southeast Asian jungles, but in the Bell UH-1 Iroquois design specifications. When the Army deployed Hueys to Vietnam in 1962, they arrived as utility aircraft, unarmored, lightly armed, built for medevac and transport during what planners assumed would be limited advisory operations. The original HU-1 designation meant helicopter utility. Crews shortened it to Huey. The name stuck. Early Hueys flew without dedicated door guns. Crews improvised. M1 carbines, M14S, M16S held out doorways by soldiers hoping to suppress ground fire. The dedicated door gunner concept emerged from necessity, not planning. As insertions into contested landing zones became routine, crews discovered they needed suppressive fire during flight's most vulnerable phase, those final 30 seconds of descent when the helicopter slowed, steadied, and hovered 3 feet above ground while troops dismounted. By 1963, the M67.62 mm machine gun became standard equipment on both Huey sides. Unloaded, the M60 weighed 24 pounds. With ammunition, door gunners managed over 200 pounds of weapon system. The gun could fire 700 rounds per minute. Practically, gunners fired controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppression. Initially mounted on pintles, swiveling posts allowing limited motion. As the war progressed, crews switched to bungee cords suspended from cabin ceilings. The cords supported the weapon's weight while granting gunners complete freedom of movement. This evolution seemed like improvement. More flexibility meant better coverage. Better coverage meant more effective suppression. But it meant something else too. It meant door gunners had to lean farther from the aircraft to engage targets. More exposure. More vulnerability. The very adaptation making them more effective also made them easier to kill. Warrant Officer John Masaki reached Vietnam in 1968. Assigned to a UH-1C gunship unit, he'd completed door gunner and crew chief school stateside, learning helicopter maintenance and M60 operation. Nothing in that training prepared him for reality. In a later interview, he described his first combat insertion. Noise made conversation impossible. Rotor blade vibration overhead, engine roar, wind screaming through the open cabin. Then the aircraft commander signaled. They descended toward the landing zone. Door gunners on each side opened fire. Masaki squeezed the trigger. The M60 roared. Spent casings and belt links ejected into a canvas bag attached to the gun, preventing them from being sucked into the rotor system or falling on troops below. He aimed at the tree line, watching his tracers, every fifth round glowing red, arcing toward the jungle. Firing before seeing the enemy. Firing to keep them suppressed. Firing because the moment you stop is the moment they have time to aim. Incoming fire sounded different from outgoing. Outgoing had rhythm, purpose. Incoming cracked past with random chaos. Masaki heard rounds snap past his head. Saw aluminum skin puncture. One round came up through the floor, missing him by inches. Later, he learned it had lodged in the Bible of the soldier beside him. The helicopter completed the insertion and climbed out. Masaki checked himself. Unwounded. But the mission wasn't over. They'd fly 12 more insertions that day. The concept of the hot LZ defined the door gunner experience. A hot landing zone meant the enemy actively engaged helicopters during landing. Artillery would prep the zone first, pounding the area with high explosives. Then gunships would make rocket runs, 2.75-inch rockets, and minigun bursts. Finally, the slicks, troop-carrying Hueys, would come in. 8 to 10 helicopters in formation, carrying 60 to 80 soldiers total. Door gunners on the slicks would open fire during descent, suppressing remaining enemy positions. In theory, this preparation reduced risk. Practically, the NVA and Viet Cong learned to wait. They dug fighting positions with overhead cover. They positioned troops in concealed locations with clear fields of fire toward landing zones. They learned helicopter approach patterns. Most critically, they learned to concentrate fire on helicopters themselves rather than troops they carried. A downed helicopter meant a crashed aircraft, probably wounded crew, definitely a valuable prize to capture or destroy. It meant other helicopters would attempt rescue, creating more targets. Specialist Thomas Pena flew co-pilot on Chalk 2 during an insertion near the Cambodian border. Flight lead called the LZ clear. No enemy contact. Chalk 1 landed successfully. Chalk 2 began its approach. Then the tree line erupted. AK-47 fire, distinctively sharp cracks. RPG-7 rockets, recognizable by their whoosh and trailing smoke. Heavy machine gun fire, probably a 12.7 mm DSHK, what Americans called .51 caliber. The door gunner on Pena's aircraft returned fire immediately. The crew chief on the other side did the same. But an RPG streaked toward them. It missed by feet, exploding in trees beyond. Small arms fire tore through thin aluminum skin. The Huey had minimal armor. Pilots sat in armored seats, but only because lessons from previous casualties demanded it. Door gunners had no such protection. They wore flak vests designed to stop shrapnel, not rifle rounds. Some wore ceramic body armor plates, nicknamed chicken plates, 22 pounds of chest-shaped protection worn inside the flak jacket. But the plates only covered vital organs. Arms, legs, head, all remained exposed. Pena's helicopter took multiple hits. He heard the distinctive sound of rounds punching through aluminum, felt the shudder as hydraulic lines severed. The aircraft commander fought the controls as the Huey lost altitude. They crashed short of the landing zone. Pena survived with injuries. The door gunner did not. An AK-47 round had struck him in the head during descent. He was 19 years old, 3 months in country. The exposure factor defined door gunner mortality. Consider the physics. A helicopter in landing phase flies at 10 to 15 knots, roughly 12 to 17 miles per hour. It descends at 300 to 500 feet per minute. At this speed and descent rate, the aircraft becomes a relatively stable target for ground fire. The door gunner standing in the open doorway or sitting on the deck's edge presents a clear silhouette against sky. He cannot take cover, cannot maneuver. He can only fire and hope suppression keeps enemy heads down long enough to complete the insertion. The M60 itself created additional vulnerability. To engage targets effectively, gunners had to expose themselves, lean out, extend the weapon, track targets as the helicopter moved. This required constant movement, constant adjustment, and constant exposure. Veterans described it as being a target in a shooting gallery, except the target shot back. Weapon malfunctions added to the danger. The M60 was notoriously prone to jamming in Vietnam's heat and humidity. The rotating bolt could fail. The extractor could break. The exposed barrel latch, a swinging lever, would catch on equipment and accidentally release, causing the barrel to fall out during flight. When a jam occurred, gunners had to clear it immediately. This meant taking attention from the enemy, taking hands off the weapon, working the problem while hostile fire continued. Warrant Officer Ron Timberlake commanded Chalk 6 during the same operation where Pena crashed. Timberlake heard the radio call that Chalk 2 was down. He heard the flight leader abort remaining insertions. But Timberlake saw wounded Americans on the ground. He made a decision that would earn him the Silver Star. He brought Chalk 6 back into the landing zone. The approach was 90 degrees off the planned axis, directly facing enemy battalions firing from the tree line. Timberlake's door, gunners opened fire during descent. M60s hammering, trying to suppress multiple enemy positions simultaneously. RPG rounds whooshed past the helicopter. Small arms fire punched through the aircraft. The gunners kept firing, kept exposing themselves, kept doing the job. Chalk 6 landed. 10 wounded Americans scrambled aboard. The North Vietnamese concentrated fire on the stationary helicopter. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. Finally, fully loaded, Timberlake lifted off. Both door gunners had been hit. One wounded, but functional. One killed during the ground time. The helicopter made it back to base trailing hydraulic fluid and smoking. The casualty mathematics became unavoidable by late 1965. Intelligence officers at every aviation unit tracked the numbers. Door gunners were being killed and wounded at rates exceeding infantry machine gunners. This seemed counterintuitive. Ground-based machine gunners were high-priority targets. Enemy forces specifically targeted them because of the weapon's effectiveness. Yet door gunners, supposedly protected by being in an aircraft, were dying faster. The reason became clear through combat analysis. Ground-based machine gunners could use cover. They could exploit terrain. They could shift positions between engagements. They operated as part of larger units, providing mutual support and security. Door gunners had none of these advantages. Door gunners flew in predictable patterns toward known landing zones. They operated from platforms that couldn't stop, couldn't take cover, couldn't maneuver effectively at low altitude. And they were silhouetted against sky, visible from hundreds of meters away. The Army began studying door gunner tactics in detail by mid-1964. Training was formalized. Schools were established. But training could only accomplish so much. The fundamental problem wasn't training. It was mission profile. Helicopters conducting combat assaults had to fly low, had to fly slow, had to hover in or near the landing zone. These requirements created vulnerability no amount of training could eliminate. Captain Robert Sholey commanded a rifle company during Central Highlands operations. He worked closely with helicopter crews and understood their limitations. In a post-war interview, he described watching insertions from the ground. The helicopters would appear flying in formation. Door gunners would be clearly visible in open doors, weapons extended. As aircraft descended, you could see gunners leaning out, firing, trying to cover every possible threat sector. Then the aircraft would touch down or hover, and troops would jump. During those final seconds, door gunners were the only thing standing between his men and concentrated enemy fire. They drew fire. They took fire. They died doing it. But they kept his soldiers alive long enough to get boots on the ground. The weapon load made survival even more difficult. Door gunners typically carried 1,000 rounds of 7.62 mm ammunition, sometimes more. Ammunition belts hung from cabin ceilings or were stored in cans secured to the floor. This ammunition was explosive. A tracer or incendiary round striking ammunition storage could detonate the entire supply. Several helicopters were lost this way. Enemy fire would penetrate the cabin, strike the ammunition, and the resulting explosion would destroy the aircraft. Door gunners sat next to this hazard throughout every mission. Enemy tactics evolution made the situation progressively worse. The NBA learned from experience. Early in the war, they'd engage helicopters with whatever weapons were available. Individual soldiers with AK-47s, small unit actions with light machine guns. But by 1965, they developed dedicated anti-aircraft tactics. They positioned heavy machine guns along known helicopter routes. They pre-positioned RPG-17s near potential landing zones. They trained soldiers to lead targets, aiming ahead of helicopters to compensate for movement. The 12.7 mm DSHK heavy machine gun proved particularly deadly. This weapon, equivalent to the American .50 caliber Browning, could punch through helicopter aluminum like tissue paper. It had range, penetration, and rate of fire sufficient to track moving aircraft. The North Vietnamese would position these weapons on hills overlooking valleys where helicopters had to fly. The guns would fire in short bursts to avoid counterfire, but those bursts were devastatingly effective. A single burst could shred a helicopter's tail boom, sever control cables, or kill crew members. The RPG-7 added another dimension of lethality. Originally designed as an anti-tank weapon, the rocket-propelled grenade proved equally effective against helicopters. The cone-shaped warhead, traveling at 300 meters per second, could destroy a Huey with a single hit. The shaped charge would penetrate thin skin and detonate inside, shredding the interior with shrapnel and overpressure. Door gunners had no defense against RPGs. They could see them coming, watch the smoke trail, but couldn't evade. The helicopter would either be hit or it wouldn't. Luck, not skill, determined survival. By 1966, over 11,800 helicopters of all types had served in Vietnam. Approximately 5,000 were destroyed, almost all by hostile fire. These numbers meant roughly 42% of all helicopters sent to Vietnam were shot down or damaged beyond repair. For crew members, this created statistical certainty. Fly enough missions, and you'd be shot down. The only question was whether you survived the crash and subsequent combat. Door gunner Michael Holman flew with the 281st Assault Helicopter Company. He described a typical mission profile. 15 Hueys would fly into the A Shau Valley, a known hotspot near the Laotian border. They'd fly out with 6 or 7. The others would be shot down or so badly damaged they had to divert to other bases for emergency repairs. He once flew on a helicopter whose engine quit mid-flight. The pilot managed an emergency landing in what Holman described as the middle of nowhere. They waited for rescue, completely exposed, while friendly forces scrambled to reach them before the enemy did. The psychological impact of this constant danger created what medical personnel called combat stress reaction. Door gunners flew multiple missions daily, typically 4 to 6, sometimes more during major operations. Each mission meant 30 minutes to 2 hours of potential combat. Morning insertions, afternoon resupply, evening extractions. The cycle repeated daily for the one-year tour. There was no rear area for door gunners. Every flight could be their last. The close quarters of helicopter combat made casualties even more traumatic. In ground combat, soldiers often didn't see the moment a comrade was hit. In helicopters, the crew was confined to a space roughly 10 feet by 6 feet. When a door gunner was hit, everyone saw it, heard it, felt it. The crew chief, sitting across from the door gunner, watched him die. The pilots heard the impact. The soldiers being transported witnessed the horror. There was nowhere to look away, no way to process it before the next mission began. Crew chiefs had an additional burden. They were responsible for maintaining the aircraft and serving as door gunners. This dual role meant they had intimate knowledge of every system on the helicopter. They knew where hydraulic lines ran, where fuel cells were located, which components were armored and which weren't. This knowledge meant they understood exactly how vulnerable they were. They knew an AK-47 round through the wrong location could bring down the aircraft. They knew thin aluminum skin provided no protection. They knew they were one lucky shot away from death. The famous LZ X-ray battle during the Ia Drang campaign in November 1965 illustrated door gunner vulnerability on a massive scale. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment conducted combat assaults into a small clearing at the base of Chupong Mountain. Intelligence indicated NVA units in the area. The first wave landed successfully. Then, the enemy attacked in force. 3 NVA regiments, roughly 3,000 soldiers, had been waiting in prepared positions. Helicopters continued flying insertions into the landing zone throughout the day. 16 Hueys per wave, making the 34-mile round trip to pick up more troops. Every insertion came under increasingly heavy fire. Door gunners watched NVA soldiers moving through elephant grass, saw muzzle flashes from dozens of positions, returned fire while incoming rounds tore through their aircraft. Captain Ed Freeman flew 14 missions into LZ X-ray that first day. Major Bruce Crandall flew 22. Both flew unarmed Hueys, medevac birds with red crosses painted on the nose. Geneva Convention rules prohibited arming medical aircraft. Door gunners carried only personal sidearms. They watched helplessly as enemy fire shredded their helicopters. They couldn't return fire, couldn't suppress the enemy, could only sit in open doors and hope incoming rounds missed. Freeman described the experience decades later. They were eating helicopters alive. I took over 50 rounds in my helicopter. The attack was so intense that helicopter operations into the landing zone were shut down multiple times. Aircraft had to be swapped out due to battle damage. Door gunners were wounded or killed and replaced with volunteers from other crews. Suppressive fire from door gunners on armed helicopters was the only thing keeping casualty evacuation going. Without them, the entire operation would have collapsed. The toll was horrific. By the end of the 4-day battle, 79 Americans had been killed at LZ X-ray, 121 wounded. Helicopter losses and damage were catastrophic. But door gunners had done their job. They'd kept firing, kept their aircraft operational long enough to insert reinforcements and extract wounded. They paid for it with their lives and blood. The armor problem persisted throughout the war despite attempts at solutions. Engineers developed various armor kits for Hueys, ceramic plates that could be bolted to floors, additional armor for pilot seats, armored fuel cells that could survive small arms fire. But adding armor meant adding weight. Adding weight meant reducing payload. A Huey could carry 8 soldiers, or 6 soldiers plus armor. Commanders faced impossible choices: protection for crew or capacity for mission. Most units chose capacity. The mission came first. Door gunners understood this. They knew the priorities. Getting troops into the fight mattered more than protecting crew. Extracting wounded mattered more than crew safety. The mission always came first. So they flew without adequate protection. Flew knowing every flight could end with a bullet through the cabin. Flew anyway. The medical treatment statistics revealed something remarkable about helicopter warfare. Average time from wounding to hospitalization in Vietnam was less than 1 hour. In World War II and Korea, that time was measured in days. Helicopter medevac, dust-off missions, saved thousands of lives. Soldiers who would have died in previous wars survived because helicopters could reach them quickly. But helicopter crews paid for those lives. Dust-off operations were 3 times more hazardous than other helicopter missions. Crews flew into hot landing zones without gunship support, often without door gunners, just pilots, medics, and desperate hope they could get in and out before being destroyed. Major Charles Kelly commanded a dust-off unit. His radio call sign was Dust-Off 6-5. On July 1, 1964, Kelly received a call for emergency evacuation near Vinh Long. Troops were pinned down in heavy combat with the Viet Cong. Wounded needed immediate evacuation or they die. Kelly made the decision to fly into an active combat zone. His Huey took fire on approach. He completed the landing. Medics and the door gunner loaded wounded while enemy fire continued. Kelly lifted off. An enemy round struck him in the chest, killing him instantly. The helicopter crashed. The crew chief managed to radio for help before the Viet Cong overran the position. Kelly's last words before being hit: "When I have your wounded." The phrase became the medevac motto. It captured everything about door, gunner, and helicopter crew philosophy. When I have your wounded. The mission matters more than personal safety. The troops on the ground matter more than crew in the air. Kelly received the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, the nation's second highest award for valor. His story exemplified door gunner courage. They flew into impossible situations knowing they probably wouldn't survive. Flew anyway because soldiers needed them. The technical vulnerabilities of the Huey compounded crew exposure. The UH-1 series had a large exposed main rotor system. The tail rotor was equally vulnerable. A single round through the tail rotor drive shaft meant loss of control. The engine, mounted directly above and behind pilots, was exposed to fire from below. Rounds coming up through cabin floors could strike the engine, transmission, or rotor head. Any one of these hits could be catastrophic. The most vulnerable area was called the chin bubble, the plexiglass section beneath pilots' feet, covering anti-torque pedals. This section provided visibility but no protection. Rounds coming up from the ground would pass through the chin bubble and strike pilots in legs, groin, or lower torso. Many pilots were killed this way. Door gunners, sitting farther back in the cabin, had slightly better protection from this angle of fire. But slightly better still meant minimal. The fuel system presented another critical vulnerability. The Huey carried fuel in cells located in the lower center section of the fuselage. Enemy fire striking these cells could cause leaks, or worse, ignition. Tracer rounds were particularly dangerous. The incendiary component could ignite fuel vapor, causing an explosion. Multiple helicopters were lost this way. The crew would have no warning, just a sudden fireball, and the aircraft tumbling from the sky. Door gunners learned to recognize signs of critical damage. Engine sound changing. The helicopter vibrating differently. Hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines. When damage occurred, the crew had seconds to decide: continue the mission or abort. Most continued, completing the insertion, extracting the wounded, finishing what they started. Door gunners kept firing until the helicopter was on the ground or until they physically couldn't continue. The enemy learned to exploit helicopter vulnerabilities systematically. They studied American tactics, noted approach patterns, understood timing. They learned helicopters would circle before landing, always from the same direction. They learned door gunners fired in predictable arcs. They learned to wait until helicopters committed to approach, then open fire at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The most sophisticated tactic involved positioning multiple weapons for crossfire. Heavy machine guns would fire from one direction, forcing door gunners to concentrate suppression there. RPG teams would fire from a different angle, catching the helicopter during evasive maneuvers. Small arms fire from a third direction would target crew specifically. This triangulated fire was devastating. Door gunners couldn't suppress all threats simultaneously. Something always got through. By 1967, North Vietnamese anti-aircraft capabilities had evolved to include dedicated AAA, 23mm Zu-23 cannons, 37mm guns, even surface-to-air missiles in some areas. These weapons transformed helicopter operations from merely dangerous to nearly suicidal. The Zu-23 could track a helicopter and fire explosive shells that detonated on proximity. A single hit anywhere on the helicopter could destroy it. Door gunners had no defense. They couldn't suppress these positions with M60 fire. They could only hope pilots saw the threat in time to evade. The psychological preparation for door gunner duty was minimal. Soldiers went through aircraft maintenance school if they were crew chiefs. Door gunner school lasted a few weeks: marksmanship training, aircraft systems, survival procedures. Then Vietnam. The training couldn't replicate reality, couldn't prepare them for the sound of rounds punching through aluminum inches from their heads, couldn't prepare them for watching a soldier across from them take a round in the throat, couldn't prepare them for the absolute helplessness of being a target with nowhere to hide. Victor Renza arrived in Vietnam as a specialist force assigned to the 4th Infantry Division. He'd qualified expert on the M60 during training at Fort Lewis. When he deployed, his company had 8 M60s for 150 men. Renza was assigned as number 1 gun in 2nd Platoon. He trained until he could disassemble and reassemble the M60 blindfolded. By the time he reached Vietnam, the weapon felt like an extension of his body. His training instructors told him the life expectancy of a machine gunner was 7 seconds from the moment the first round was fired. This statistic was designed to emphasize danger, to prepare them psychologically. But it also carried dark truth. Machine gunners were high-priority targets. The enemy knew the weapon's effectiveness, knew that neutralizing the M60 increased their chances of survival. So they shot at machine gunners first. Door gunners faced the same targeting priority, but with added vulnerability. They couldn't dig in, couldn't use terrain, couldn't shift positions after engaging. They were locked in place by the aircraft, visible from long distances, unable to maneuver. The combination made them the highest priority target on any helicopter. Kill the door gunners, and the helicopter became much easier to shoot down. The 1st Cavalry Division, the first fully airmobile division in Army history, conducted more helicopter combat assaults than any other unit. Their operations in the Central Highlands and Ashau Valley defined air cavalry tactics. They also defined door gunner casualty rates. In some companies, door gunner positions had 100% turnover every 6 months. Every single door gunner was either killed, wounded, or rotated out. Replacements arrived constantly, were trained by veterans who'd been in country maybe 3 months. Then the veterans were hit, and the new guys became the veterans. The cycle repeated endlessly. Memorial services became routine. Helicopters shot down. Crews killed. Memorial services at base camp. Then back to flying. There was no time to grieve, no time to process. The missions continued. The insertions continued. The casualties continued. Door gunners developed coping mechanisms, dark humor, superstitions, rituals before flights. Anything to maintain psychological equilibrium in an environment designed to break them. Some door gunners volunteered for the position. The Army Aviation Badge required a certain number of combat flight hours. Door gunner duty provided those hours quickly. Others were assigned because they had the right military occupational specialty. Crew chief training automatically included door gunner duties. Some infantry soldiers volunteered during specific operations because units were short of door gunners. Regardless of how they arrived at the position, the experience was the same: exposure, vulnerability, constant danger. The relationship between door gunners and the troops they transported was unique in Vietnam. Infantry soldiers respected door gunners in a way they respected few others. The infantrymen saw what door gunners did, saw them leaning out of helicopters, firing while under fire themselves, saw them continuing to fight while wounded, saw them die protecting the insertion. That respect was mutual. Door gunners knew the infantrymen were going into landing zones that might be heavily defended, knew those soldiers would be fighting on the ground while the helicopter flew away to safety. The shared danger created bonds that transcended normal military relationships. Extraction missions were often more dangerous than insertions. When a unit on the ground needed emergency extraction, the situation was usually desperate: heavy contact with the enemy, casualties that couldn't walk, low ammunition. Helicopters would fly in knowing they were entering an active firefight. Door gunners would suppress enemy positions that might be meters from the landing zone. The crew chief would help load wounded while under fire. Pilots would hover with bullets tearing through the aircraft, then lift off, struggling to gain altitude with overloaded weight and possibly damaged systems. Warrant Officer Larry Taylor flew an AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter in Vietnam. On June 18, 1968, he was covering an extraction mission near AP Goat Song. A 4-man patrol team was surrounded and nearly out of ammunition. The Huey attempting extraction took heavy fire and had to abort. Taylor saw the situation deteriorating. He made multiple rocket and gun runs, expending all ammunition, trying to suppress the enemy. When he ran out of ammunition, he did something unprecedented. He landed his Cobra, a 2-seat attack helicopter not designed for passengers, in a tiny clearing. The 4 patrol members climbed onto the rocket pods and skids. Taylor took off with them hanging on and flew them to safety. He received the Medal of Honor for this action in 2023, 55 years after the mission. The story illustrated the lengths helicopter crews would go to save lives. It also illustrated the impossible situations door gunners faced regularly. Taylor could take risks in a Cobra because it was designed for combat, heavily armed, with better armor. Door gunners flew in Hueys with minimal protection. They couldn't make multiple passes, couldn't orbit the battlefield. They had one chance to land, complete the mission, and escape. During that window, they were completely exposed. Aviation safety investigations conducted after helicopter losses revealed patterns in door gunner casualties. Most were killed by small arms fired to the upper body or head. Ceramic body armor protected the torso, but not the neck, shoulders, or head. Helmets provided protection against shrapnel, but not direct hits from rifle rounds. The M60, mounted at chest height, meant the gunner's upper body was maximally exposed while engaging targets. Investigation reports noted that door gunners often died while still firing. Their bodies would be found with the M60 in position, ammunition belts partially expended, positions indicating they were engaging targets at the moment of death. They died doing their job. This pattern was so common, it became an expected finding in crash investigation reports. Door gunner killed in action while providing fire support. Unit citations told the story in dry military language, but beneath the words were human experiences. Specialist John Smith, killed in action while engaging enemy positions during combat assault. Specialist David Johnson, wounded in action, continuing to provide suppressive fire until evacuation completed. Warrant Officer Michael Williams remained at his position despite severe wounds to ensure extraction of ground forces. The citations accumulated. The names accumulated. The casualties accumulated. By 1968, the entire door gunner program was under review. Casualty rates were unsustainable. Units couldn't maintain qualified personnel. Training pipelines couldn't produce replacements fast enough. Aviation commanders proposed solutions: better armor, better weapons, better tactics. Some improvements were implemented. The M60E1 variant had modifications that made it more reliable. Helicopter designs improved with the introduction of the Cobra gunship, which could provide heavy fire support while keeping crews more protected. The UH-1H model had a more powerful engine, allowing it to carry armor and still maintain payload capacity. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. Combat assaults required helicopters to fly into contested areas, required them to slow down and hover, required door gunners to provide suppressive fire. These requirements created vulnerability that couldn't be eliminated. Better armor helped. Better tactics helped. But nothing could change the basic equation. Door gunners had to expose themselves to do their job. Exposure meant casualties. The statistics validated the concern. Over the entire war, approximately 2,074 non-pilot helicopter crewmen were killed. The helicopter fleet logged over 10 million flight hours. This meant roughly 0.27 deaths per 1,000 flight hours. For comparison, infantry casualties in heavy combat zones averaged 0.4 per 1,000 patrol hours. But infantry soldiers could take cover, use terrain, break contact. Door gunners could do none of these. They were locked into a flying target, doing 100 knots at 1,500 feet, with nowhere to hide. The veterans who survived carried the experiences for life. John Masaki, the door gunner who arrived in 1968, completed his year-long tour. He flew countless missions, was shot at on most of them, saw aircraft shot down, saw crew members killed. When he returned to civilian life, he had no marketable skills. Being a door gunner didn't translate to civilian employment. He considered re-enlisting, becoming a pilot, but decided against returning to Vietnam. The experience had changed him. He carried it for decades. Reunions of helicopter crews decades after the war revealed the lasting impact. Survivors would gather and talk about specific missions, specific landing zones, specific moments when they should have died but somehow survived. They would honor the ones who didn't come home. The door gunners killed in action. the crew chiefs who died at their positions, the pilots shot down attempting impossible rescues. These reunions weren't celebrations. They were memorials, acknowledgments of sacrifice that most Americans never understood. The Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association maintains detailed records of all helicopter operations in Vietnam. Their database includes 7,013 Hueys that survived the war out of over 11,000 deployed, 42% destroyed. The database lists 6,175 total deaths in helicopter operations, 2,202 pilots, 2,074 aircrew, 1,869 passengers. The aircrew category includes door gunners, crew chiefs, and other non-pilot positions. Door gunners were the majority. These numbers exist in military archives and historical databases, but they represent individual humans. 19-year-olds who graduated high school and were drafted. 22-year-olds who volunteered because they wanted to fly. 25-year-olds on their second tour because they felt obligated to serve. Each number was a person with family, dreams, a future that ended in a landing zone in Vietnam. The door gunner position remained throughout the war despite the casualties. The mission required it. Combat assaults required suppressive fire. Extractions required covering fire. Medical evacuations required protection. No alternative existed that provided the same capability. So young Americans continued to volunteer or be assigned, continued to climb into Hueys, continued to sit in open doors with M60 machine guns, continued to fly into hot landing zones, continued to die doing it. The tactical evolution by 1969 included hunter-killer teams. Light observation helicopters would fly low, draw fire, locate enemy positions. Attack helicopters would orbit high, waiting. When the enemy revealed themselves by shooting at the scout, the attack helicopter would strike. This tactic reduced door gunner casualties on observation helicopters because scouts flew with minimal crew. But slicks, the transport Hueys, still needed door gunners. The infantry still needed transport. The wounded still needed evacuation. The fundamental mission remained unchanged. Gradual American withdrawal from Vietnam reduced helicopter operations after 1969. Fewer troops meant fewer combat assaults. Vietnamization, the transition of combat operations to South Vietnamese forces, meant American aviation units flew fewer missions. But missions continued until 1973. American door gunners continued to fly and die, protecting operations that were increasingly viewed as pointless by the American public. The last American helicopter to leave Vietnam was a Huey. The iconic image of people climbing a ladder to a rooftop to board an evacuation helicopter was actually an Air America civilian Huey, not a military aircraft. The building wasn't the embassy, but an apartment complex. But the image captured the end. Helicopters, which had defined American operations in Vietnam, carried Americans out at the end. The door gunners who served received relatively little recognition. The Huey itself became iconic. Movies and documentaries featured the distinctive sound of rotor blades. Pilots who flew dangerous missions received medals and recognition. The infantry who fought on the ground were honored as veterans. But door gunners existed in a strange middle space. Not pilots, not infantry, just young Americans who sat in open doorways with machine guns and tried to keep everyone else alive. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. lists 58,320 names. Among those names are the 2,074 aircrew members killed in helicopter operations. Their names are carved in black granite alongside infantry soldiers, advisors, pilots, and all the others who died. No designation separates door gunners from other casualties. They are simply names. But each name represents someone who made the choice to serve in what they knew was one of the most dangerous positions in the war. In 2024, 50 years after the war ended, the surviving door gunners are in their 70s and 80s. Many attend veteran reunions. Many participate in memorial services. They tell stories about missions that happened half a century ago with clarity that suggests the memories never faded. They describe landing zones, firefights, helicopter crashes, friends who died. The stories aren't bragging. They're testimony. Witness accounts of experiences that younger generations struggle to comprehend. The analysis of why door gunners didn't survive Vietnam comes down to simple factors: extreme exposure in open doors, minimal protection from hostile fire, high priority targets for enemy forces, aircraft that operated in predictable patterns at vulnerable speeds and altitudes, missions that required them to fly into the most dangerous situations repeatedly. The cumulative effect of these factors created casualty rates that would be unacceptable in any modern military operation. Modern helicopter operations learned from Vietnam. The UH-60 Blackhawk that replaced the Huey has door guns that fire from cabin windows, not open doors. Crew members have improved armor. Helicopters have defensive systems, radar warning receivers, missile warning systems, countermeasures. Tactics emphasize standoff distance and rapid ingress-egress. The lessons were written in the blood of door gunners who flew Hueys in Vietnam. But no amount of modern technology changes what those door gunners did. They flew into hot landing zones knowing the odds. They provided suppressive fire that saved countless infantry lives. They protected medical evacuation helicopters that rescued thousands of wounded soldiers. They died at rates that exceeded almost every other military position. They did it for a year-long tour, mission after mission, day after day, until they were killed, wounded, or completed their service. The final assessment isn't about statistics or tactics or equipment. It's about human courage. Door gunners understood the danger. Every veteran interviewed described knowing the position was extremely hazardous. But they did it anyway. They did it because soldiers on the ground needed them, because wounded men needed evacuation, because the mission required it. That understanding, that willingness to serve despite knowing the likely outcome, that defines their service. The door gunners who didn't survive Vietnam left families behind. Mothers and fathers who received telegrams. Wives who became widows. Children who grew up without fathers. Brothers and sisters who mourned siblings. The casualties extended beyond the individual killed in action. Every death created ripples that spread through communities, families, generations. The cost wasn't just 2,074 names on a memorial. It was the cumulative impact on everyone connected to those individuals. The survivors carry guilt. Survivor's guilt is well documented among combat veterans. Why did I survive when others died? What made me special? Door gunners who completed their tours describe watching friends die, watching helicopters crash, watching young men bleed out in the cabin during extraction flights. They survived through what they describe as luck, being in the right place, the enemy shooting at someone else, pure chance. That randomness makes survival harder to process. In the end, the story of Vietnam door gunners isn't about statistics or casualty rates or tactical analysis. It's about Americans who served when called, who flew dangerous missions because someone had to, who died protecting others in one of war's most exposed positions. Their legacy lives in the soldiers they saved, the missions they completed, and the lessons their sacrifice taught. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals who gave everything while sitting in an open door with an M60 machine gun, firing into the jungle below, knowing that every mission might be their last. That is why door gunners didn't survive Vietnam. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, but because the mission itself was designed to trade their safety for everyone else's survival. They understood that trade. They accepted it. They paid the price. And history owes them recognition for a sacrifice that too few Americans understand or appreciate.